Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Schwartz, the head of strategic planning for Salesforce, and I have a really amazing afternoon for you. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce two of my dear friends, Isabella Kirkland and Carolyn Porco. Two people who have found remarkable beauty in nature, one in deep space and the other in life on Earth. Izzy Kirkland is someone I've known for many, many, many years. Dear friend, lives in Sausalito, and she has found remarkable insight into the natural world, deep understanding of what's going on, and amazing art that captures it. Her work is shown all over the world. It's on the cover of the books of E.O. Wilson. She has an amazing studio in Sausalito. We're going to be putting some of her art in one of our buildings over here, 350 Mission, on our floor. And what you will be amazed to discover is how interesting and how pornographic the lives of nematodes are. That'll be the first talk. The second is Carolyn Porco. And Carolyn is the head of the Cassini imaging team. And Cassini is a space probe orbiting out, well, actually, I think it's now no longer orbiting, but it was orbiting around Saturn for a number of years. And she was the bus driver. It's the size of a bus. She pointed Cassini everywhere to take pictures of Saturn, of its moons. And perhaps the most amazing astronomical picture ever taken, which she will share with you today. And the way I describe it is I think she has the best slideshow in the solar system. So you will be informed, inspired, and entertained by Izzy Kirkland and Carolyn Porco. Please welcome Izzy Kirkland.
Thank you. Thank you, darling. Hi. I'm a painter. Paintings are analog, yes? However, my analog paintings are data-driven. I don't just choose them to be pretty. The Dutch still life painters that I study, their paintings are 400 years old now, and some of them look so crisp and clear you can actually type the insects from the paintings. So I decided that my mission is to send data-loaded paintings into the future. So I began my career making art as a sculptor. I made things out of garbage for the most part, and I built temporary installations. That kind of weird little building on the left is a library for one person full of handmade books. Now the problem with these were fun installations, but they only lasted a little while, and then the parts all dissipated. So in the 90s, oh, I forgot about taxidermy. I did study and practice taxidermy, even in New York City, and I have used that skill to make study skins for museums and mount birds for Hawk Hill and other small museums. But in the 90s, I turned to painting, partly because I wanted to reduce my own ecological footprint. It takes about 4 tablespoons of paint to make a 3 by 4 foot painting, this illusionary space. And part of why I turned to painting too is because, this was the 90s, Y2K was looming. We knew about climate change. We knew about the coming 6th extinction. And friends were founding the Long Now. And longevity was the zeitgeist. So I decided to try to do that too, make something that was worthy and something that was lasting. Here's a still life by Jan Davidson de Heem, one of these great master still life artists that I studied. And in 96, 97, somewhere around there, I and thousands of other people got this mailer from the Nature Conservancy, 500 of the most endangered species in the United States. And you know how, whoops, sorry, looking at the wrong slide. Here's the still life, and here's the mailer. I had just one of those turning points in your life where it's just all the lights go on. So what I decided to do, what my intent in the experiment I'm going to show you, was to marry modern biodiversity science and this really antique kind of painting. This was my first experiment. It's called Descendant. It's 61 species of endangered animals and plants from the US, with a few exceptions. And it worked. It worked for a number of reasons, I think. It'd be nice if I could remember what they are, wouldn't it? It had a really broad theme, and I did tons of research to work on this painting. It took about a year. And every single thing is at life size. I go back to the original scientific description to understand what are some of the diagnostic characteristics of the animal and to make it as close to life as I can possibly make it. It's not an easy kind of work, but it is very purpose-driven. So I tried to come up with, how am I going to make this work? And these are some of the ways I tried to address these complex issues. One was to work thematically across different arcs in conservation. Another was to be accurate with the science. Who wants to make a mistake for 400 years? And another was to ensure the longevity of the paintings themselves. So thematically, each painting sort of grew out of the last one. As I read about endangerment, I would read about what causes it. And one of the things that causes endangerment is we used to call them invasive species. We try not to do that anymore. They're more often called opportunistic species. But something coming from the outside often displaces a native species by just out-competing it. So I tried to use the words descendant and ascendant because their numbers were just going up and down without any judgment. These are really successful animals. You can see that something like a largemouth bass, bullfrogs, we can find those everywhere where people are. And some of these wonderfully successful animals are so successful that they're actually a problem, like the water milfoil and the water hyacinth. They're problems in fresh waterways all over the world. So what came after that was this idea of looking at black market trade, because third in line in terms of money earned in black market, first comes guns, then humans, and then wildlife. So we all understand how a black market works. It's something, it's illegal trade. As something gets rare, it drives the market to collect it. The more rare it gets, the more expensive it gets. It's just an awful loop, and it affects a lot of endangered species, particularly birds and reptiles. But what is a gray market? That's a little bit different issue. There's a plant here on the right that has 5 leaves. That's American ginseng. Now, ginseng lives in the mid-Atlantic states in the mountains. A lot of people there use it as a cash crop because they need extra money. And there's nothing wrong with that, but ginseng does happen to grow in the area of the world's concentration of salamanders live there. And we don't really know what taking tons of ginseng out of their habitat is going to do, so it's an unregulated market. To include the science with the paintings is a bit tricky because it doesn't come with it automatically, if you know what I mean. It takes research to find it, or I try to force it on there. So whenever I exhibit the paintings, I make sure that there's ancillary material that provides the scope and a lot of details about the painting. Each painting begins as a database, really, of potential candidates that might fit under the theme I'm working on. So I start by after I have the database, I make scale drawings of every single thing that's going to be included on tracing paper. Then I can move them around and find some way to make them make logical sense in this micron-wide space I've built in my head. I worked on 6 paintings that were like this, that followed themes of endangerment, extinction, black market trade, etc. And I had planned to put one more so I would have a perfect chord of 7 paintings. However, as I was going around doing research for the previous 6 paintings, I would meet with collection managers and take photographs, and they would say, yes, that thing you just photographed was really cool, but you should see what I just brought back from Suriname, or Burma or Thailand. And their enthusiasm was so exciting that I got completely interested in discovery and how new species are found, how they are searched for. And instead of making 1 painting, I actually made 4. And I called that the Nova Cycle. They were divided up into sort of elevations of a rainforest. The other way that I try to ensure that the science sticks with the paintings is that I make sure that when they're exhibited, I give people these placards to carry around so they can read about what they're looking at. On one side is a description of the theme, and then stories from individual species in the paintings that sort of illuminate the theme. And on the other side, I have a numbered key and a species list so that you can kind of play Where's Waldo and actually learn something. Sometimes there are dates, where the things are from, etc. So I try to build the science as part of the work. After working on land-based species in 10 paintings over 10 years, I decided to work on ocean issues, since it's 7/10 of the world and has been described as the great last frontier on Earth. So I picked something that is in every ocean, at every depth, and a lot of people don't know about it. So that's what nudibranchs are. These are sea slugs, just like garden slugs, only the marine version. Jokingly say they look like they were invented by Dr. Seuss and then made by Dale Chihuly, because they are really crazy looking. They're ranged in scale from 4 millimeters to 500. This is about 5% of the world total, and they go smaller and larger. Why are they these colors? 20 feet down, we can't see anything but blue. So are they for each other? We don't really know. Nudibranchs don't have eyes. They have light-sensing organs, but their world, basically, they smell chemically. So some nudibranchs, like the one on the left, gets its color from what it eats. Others, like the phylodesmian on the other side, gets its color from commensurate algae that live in it, called zooxanthellae. Those algae actually produce photosynthesize, and then they share the sugars from that. But others are just like purple with green spots, and we assume that that's some kind of aposematic coloring that says, I'm this crazy color, I'm toxic, don't eat me. But others, we just really have no idea. Because I got to look at one large group of organisms instead of across many types of organisms with this work, I came across some really amazing stories, and this is one of them. It just is a perfect illustration of how unique a species can be. These are side-gilled slugs. They're an osteobranch, like nudibranchs, not too distant. And the paper caught my eye about these because it said penile fencing in nudibranchs. I'm going like, what? But they're all nudibranchs and osteobranchs are hermaphrodites. They have both sets of equipment. I think it's partly because they're short-lived. It's hard to find each other. They need to be ready. But these particular slugs have a stylet in the tip of the penis, and when they get together, they actually joust, trying to stab the other guy first. So the stabbee in that stylet gets a little dose of hormones that makes it be the female in this particular mating, which, as far as we know, is absolutely unique in the world. I always feel like I have to see things with my own eyes. This looks like a typical one of the photographs I would take, but it's actually a painting. These are little warblers that Audubon named that are extinct. And when you read the description, look at other people's photographs, there are a lot of things you miss. The description is often diagnostic, but it does not really describe. And you miss things like the fact that the white on the belly of this little bird is very much informed by the gray underfeathers, and it's just hard to see those things in a photograph. But when it's right in front of you, you can notice. First-hand observation is why I went to Suriname in February, because I'm working with the State Department to do a different kind of picture with them for the country of Suriname, and it's not finished, so don't judge it yet, please, but probably another 2 months at least. It's 84 species and counting that are all from one place. I haven't ever worked that way, so it's a different way of looking at, it's a different way of parsing information, but one that I think will work well for that country. It's called coexistence because it's one of the most humanly diverse, culturally diverse places on the planet. So longevity is a big issue for me. If I'm trying to send a message, the thing has to last, right? So how do I do that, and why do I want to do that? This is a little wren called a Stevens Island wren, Traversia leali. And it has an apocryphal story, and somehow I want this story. The story's worth remembering, because it's so, there's just so much remorse in it. So it's a little bird that has virtually no tail, really big feet. It basically doesn't fly. And it was found on a small island in New Zealand by the lighthouse keeper when his cat brought him a dead one. So he sent it off to Britain, it got typed, yes, it's a new species, but before he ever even got that news back, his cat Tibbles and the other feral cats on the island actually had wiped out the entire species. So I don't want stories like this to be lost. I'm trying to memorialize them in a way. The little bird you can see at the bottom below the tray is the way I've painted a live Stevens Island wren. Everything in this picture, the sixth in the taxa series, was an extinct species, still an extinct species. Beauty is one of the ways I wanted to try to have these things survive. Beautiful luxury items have a tendency to be passed down and handed on. So I was trying to use that beauty so that, 4 generations from now, this isn't in a garage sale. Because it depends on being passed down for this message to go forward. So one of the ways I do that is by using, being very careful about the way I compose the paintings so that the masses are kind of equal, the colors are kind of equal. This one follows sort of a basic figure 8 composition, and I try to work so that the eye is always led somewhere different. I try not to use any pigments that are going to fade. These are a bunch of pigments that faded or were problematic for one reason or another, including this caput mortuum that was about the color of the background of the slide that was actually made from ground mummies. It's not a sustainable model, you're going to run out of mummies. And then the following 3 yellows were all problematic for one reason or another. Indian yellow was originally made from heat-treated urine from cows that were force-fed mango leaves and water. That was cruel. It's a beautiful color, though. And the other 2 were problematic because they were sold as lots of different things. The tree resin and arsenic sulfide were actually what it was supposed to be, but it was often sold something else, and so a lot of the poor people's paintings turned out really badly. So why do I bother going through all this research and all this time? Each painting takes a year. This is the top half of Understory, the second in the Nova cycle that I'm going to show you. But why would I bother? I have quite a number of reasons. And what I try to do with the work is to draw people in and have them get absorbed in the detail and in this sort of open mind space where they can learn something and possibly have a shift of mind. This painting is called the Harry Potter plant because it kind of loomed up out of the mist when it bloomed at night. And I also used it because the tree actually has a weird way of dividing, and it looks very familiar to people taxonomists who divide species into clades because it's this sort of interesting branching pattern. A second thing that I'm trying to accomplish is just to share the awe that I feel when I realize how intricately married to place and community some of these species are. They've evolved over centuries together, and it's going to get torn apart, and it breaks my heart. These are all species that went to the brink of extinction and were either husbanded back through massive human intervention, like our black-footed ferret, or were accidentally or purposely refound. So this little owl has a fantastic story, I'm watching my time, of espionage, theft, and in the end, this scientist at the Smithsonian got the FBI crime lab onto it, and they analyzed all the stuffing in the birds and the labels, and she eventually found it by going where she believed the bird should be, and found it, and it had been thought extinct for 113 years. So look up Maynard's Hagen and the Little Forest Owlet. It's a great little detective story. So, I'm awed. I just want other people to be too. A third reason that I think this work is important to do and why I'm going to keep doing it is that I want to instigate change. So if I can change people's minds a little bit, maybe they'll vote differently. It's kind of important right now. This is details from gone, so they're all species that are extinct. Each has its little spot. And some of the species in this particular painting could be really valuable for a number of reasons. One is there's a little frog in the bowl that has another frog in its mouth. That's a gastric brooding frog. There are two species, one is extinct. So it swallows the eggs, hatches them down there, and the babies come out of the esophagus, but somehow they turn off their digestive juice. That could have huge ramifications for human medicine. And on the other side, you see a passenger pigeon. We know there were billions of them, and for millennia, we know now, too. They are, among other species, like keystone species, habitat engineers. So they had a massive effect on the forests of the Northeast, which without them would have been a continuous old-growth canopy. But if 1 million passenger pigeons land in one place, they crash the trees, open this big light well, and a whole succession of forest and all the species associated with it grow there. So maybe it's worth looking at bringing them back. I mean, we're kind of in the midst of deciding how much genetic tinkering we're going to do with some of these things and how much is worth investing, and could it help us as a tool to work against climate change, to help ameliorate some of these effects of the Anthropocene. And kind of my last driving force, and the most overarching, really, in doing this work is that I want people to understand how connected everything is. So, orchid seeds, I've got lots of little orchids in this picture. Orchid seeds, some of them will sprout, and virtually none of them will propagate, actually grow, without their commensurate fungi. So, that connection is essential. That's why people have such a hard time getting orchids to grow in the greenhouse. We also know that trees send electrical impulses all up and down their body. If a bug attacks on one part, it can actually signal limbs on the rest of the tree to put out a pheromone to attract birds that would eat the bug that's attacking the tree. This is a very sophisticated kind of communication. We also know that it can talk to other trees of its species through a fungal mat beneath the forest floor. And not only that, they can speak to other species. They can cooperate, they can share sugars and nutrients, and scientists jokingly call that the wood wide web. There is another scientist in Hokkaido, at Hokkaido University, he's a marine chemist who studied what happens to leaves when they fall in a river. Doesn't sound very interesting, but it ends up being amazing. So trees leach a kind of acid into fresh water that goes to the ocean and actually promotes the growth of plankton. So here you have an inland tree 500 miles from the coast affecting and encouraging the growth of plankton in the ocean, which is one of the building blocks of life on the planet. Everything's connected. So that's a lot of weight to ask a painting to carry. It's just a painting. But I do really want the paintings, if they survive, to stand in elegy for some of these species we're bound to lose. And I also want it to be evident that it is just now dawning on us how and why and to what extent living forms are connected to one another, because I think that's a science we're still really on the very cusp of. I thank you for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Planetary scientist and Cassini imaging team lead, UC Berkeley, Carolyn Porco.
Thank you. Thank you. 26 years ago, the United States and Europe joined hands and set off on an exploratory mission. It was called Cassini, and it called for an in-depth, comprehensive examination of everything in the Saturn system. The planet Saturn, its enormous set of rings, and its collection of very many moons. And we're still in orbit around Saturn. We've been in orbit around Saturn now for 12 years. And in that time, we have become intimately familiar with this very complex, very phenomenologically rich planetary system, and we have made sensational discoveries. We have been there to witness the birth of a monster storm, the closest, the largest storm ever observed from a close spacecraft, and the kind of storm that appears on Saturn every 20 or 30 years. Okay, so it was fabulous that we were there to see this thing be born, be developed, evolve, and then eventually die, and have the opportunity to study it. We also found at the North Pole this, in vivid false color, this incredible vortex, which is half the size of the US, very much like a terrestrial hurricane. And having observations like these to study, to be able to look at a giant planet atmosphere like Saturn's and seek to determine what is common and what is different between Saturn's atmosphere and our own allows us to understand planetary processes in general, which of course make us better custodians of our own planet. Now the rings, of course, are what make Saturn the icon among planets that it is, and they consist of countless icy bodies, from the smallest bits of talcum powder all the way to the size of small apartment buildings, and they are all in independent orbit around Saturn. They're all like independent satellites themselves, and the rings are very large. They are about 280,000 kilometers across, which means they more or less would slot in very nicely between the Earth and the Moon. Okay, and being at Saturn the way we have been, we've been able, on account of the rings, to see some truly awe-inspiring sights, the kinds of things you don't see in these boring parts of the solar system where we live. So here's one. Here's a changing perspective we get of the rings as we orbit Saturn, but also go from one hemisphere to the other, and it looks, in a picture, a movie like this, with the occasional moon making an entrance, it looks as if the rings pretty much disappear. And that's because they are very, very thin. They're only about 30 feet thick. The rings have a lot of structure. We saw this picture on approach to Saturn before we got into orbit. The tiniest pixel in this picture is about 10 miles across. You see at the bottom part the outer edge of the rings, the main rings. That's the outer edge of the A ring. And the whitest part there is the B ring. And most of the structure that we understand very well in Saturn's rings is produced by resonances or gravitational perturbations with orbiting moons. And the bigger moons, which are external to the rings, are the ones that produce the largest perturbations. And they are responsible for anchoring the edges of the ring system in its place. And those are the kinds of phenomena that we expected when we got there with Cassini. But there's also lots of things we saw that was wild and crazy and we didn't expect at all. Here near the outer edge of the A-ring is a gap, and in the gap is a moon that is on an inclined orbit, and that moon produces these enormous mountainous waves of rubble that reach out of a 30-foot thick disk of ring material, reach over 2 miles high. We see a similar thing, though much more chaotic, at the outer edge of the B ring. This is where the strongest gravitational perturbation exists in Saturn's rings, and we see again these vertical piles of rubble reaching miles high above the ring plane. And I love imagining that I am in a shuttlecraft, and I'm flying low to this gleaming disk of debris, and from my vantage point, the rings would look like they extended to infinity, and they would be gleaming white, and I would be flying along and flying along and flying along, and eventually come upon a wall of rubble 2 miles high. Somebody needs to put that in a movie. And in fact, a very good friend of mine, Michael Carroll, a space artist, put it on canvas. And so I am hoping that someone someday actually gets to do this. Now, speaking of moons, Saturn is orbited by a very large collection of them, over 60 in all. And in the dozen years that we've been there, we've come to know some of them very well, and we've taken some incredible pictures in the meantime. This is Hyperion. It's a moon that's about the size of West Virginia. It's, excuse me, it's shaped like a hamburger. It's got a very complex orbit, and it looks like, as you can tell, something that somebody pulled out of the ocean. Here's a picture that was taken soon after we got into orbit around Saturn. You could see the rings at the lower part of the frame. You could see the shadows cast by the rings onto the blue winter hemisphere of Saturn. And in the corner over there, you could see the moon Mimas. Mimas is about 1/10 the size of our moon, and it is Saturn's Death Star. Okay, it is very heavily cratered, and it is pretty much geologically dead. In fact, most of the major moons of Saturn look like Mimas, very, very old. If there was any activity going on, it happened a very long time ago. But there are two moons that are particularly fascinating. There is, of course, Saturn's largest moon, Titan, which is shown here in a beautiful picture with the rings in the foreground. Titan is 50% larger than our own moon, and until Cassini got there, was the largest single expanse of unexplored terrain that we had remaining in our solar system. And we've learned a great deal about Titan as we've been in orbit, and it has been also the object of some of our most arresting images. Here is just one of them. This is Titan seen beyond the limb of Saturn with the rings cutting across the frame, a picture that could have been painted by the Russian artist Kandinsky. So we learned, before we got to Titan and Saturn with Cassini, we knew that Titan's atmosphere is very much like the Earth in some major respects, in its composition, in its thermal structure, in the pressure here we have in the room. Titan's pressure is something like 50% greater. But it is different in two important regards. It has no free oxygen, and it also has small amounts suffused through its atmosphere of organic materials like methane and ethane and propane. And those materials do two amazing things. First of all, they create a 200-kilometer thick haze that completely envelops the moon. And they can be, certainly methane and ethane, can be liquid at the surface temperatures of Titan. And so in planning Cassini's mission to Saturn, we had as cardinal goals to investigate the surface environment of Titan, to search for bodies of liquid hydrocarbons. Think nail polish remover, okay? To look for these vast bodies of liquid nail polish remover. And so for that reason, Cassini carried, along with the 12 scientific investigations on the orbiter, it carried the European-built Huygens probe. And the probe was deployed to Titan soon after we got into orbit, and it descended down through the atmosphere in mid-January of 2005. And on the way down, it took lots of measurements, and we come to understand a lot about Titan's environment because of the Huygens probe. It returned indisputable evidence for the presence of drainage systems. This is a mosaic of images taken by the probe as it fell from a height of 8 kilometers above the surface. 8 kilometers is roughly, to within a factor of 2, is roughly the height or the altitude that you would fly in a jet from San Francisco to New York. So this is not unlike the view that you would have out the window of Titanian Airlines as you flew across the surface of Titan. But finally, who can forget the landing of the probe on the surface, and then this historic picture taken from the surface by the probe looking out towards the horizon of Titan with cobbles in the foreground of ice about that big, and then the horizon in the distance. This was like something out of a Jules Verne adventure, the day that a device of our own making touched a moon in the Saturn system 10 times farther away from the sun than we are here. We learned a lot of things from the Huygens probe, but we didn't find any bodies of liquid hydrocarbons. We didn't even find a puddle. So it was very perplexing, and it was up to the orbiter a few years later to come up with indisputable evidence that there were vast seas and lakes of liquid methane and ethane in the northern polar regions of Titan. And this is this enchanting picture of a glint of sunlight off the lakes in the northern part of Titan. And this picture is a radar image because Cassini also carries a radar instrument. It's a radar image of one of those lakes with a coastline that looks something like the coast of Maine. And so Titan has turned out to be as fascinating as we thought it would be. It is the only body in our solar system that has liquid organics ponded on its surface, and in its complexity and its geographical diversity, it is rivaled only by the Earth itself. And I am certain that someday we will go back to Titan, perhaps to drop a boat, a scientific research vessel, in one of its seas in its North Polar region. And I say that the solar system still has much in store for those adventurous souls who are yet unborn. But moving on, the discovery that we have made at Cassini that I regard as the most profound is what we have found at the south pole of the small moon Enceladus, which is shown here next to Saturn. And shown here as well, hanging over England, though this is not a threat. Because what we have found gushing forth from those 4 fractures you see at the southern tip of Enceladus are over 100 geysers, erupting from an ocean that we are now certain exists beneath the surface of Enceladus, an ocean of water that is as salty as our ocean, is laced with organic compounds, and as far as we can tell, has abundant free energy. And these are all the formal hallmarks of an environment that we think can support life. And so we are therefore faced with this goosebump-raising question: did a second Genesis actually take hold on this small, unlikely icy body tucked deep within the Saturn system? And could it be that life, evidence of life, maybe even microbes, could be in the geysers that are gushing forth into space from Enceladus? And some of us are so deliriously enthralled with this idea that we are currently designing and planning a mission to go back to Enceladus to find out. We are just hoping that we are given the green light to do so. So Cassini is nearly at its end. By September 15th, less than a year from now, next year, it will be all over. Cassini's story will be all over. And I predict that it will go down in history as one of the most, if not the most, productive scientific missions that was ever flown. You can do an awful lot when you've been in orbit in the Saturn system for 12 years. But in the end, the story of Cassini, like the stories of all of our interplanetary missions over the last 6+ decades, has been at its heart a story about longing, a longing to know ourselves, a longing to understand us and how we got here and where we came from. Where did all of this come from? And despite all the beautiful scenes and images that we have seen over the last 12 years from Cassini, there is one image that speaks of this longing better than any other, and even better than words could. And it has a bit of a backstory, and I'm going to share that with you now. Back in the 1980s, I had the immense good fortune right out of graduate school to hitch a ride on the greatest exploration of them all, and that was the Voyager mission to the outer solar system. Voyagers, if you recall, visited Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune all in a row over the course of about a dozen years. And in that time, I had the privilege of coming to know someone that, of course, you will immediately recognize, Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, and of having the privilege of working with him and others in the planning and the execution of the now famous pale blue dot image of Earth taken by Voyager from beyond the orbit of Neptune on Valentine's Day, 1990. And it's not widely known, but in the proposal that Carl wrote to the Voyager project, encouraging them, urging them to take this picture, because they were reluctant initially to do it, he said that the purpose of this image was to capture the Earth, and I quote, awash in a sea of stars. Well, if you remember the pale blue dot, the Voyager pale blue dot image, it didn't exactly look the way we had anticipated. There are no stars in it, and the image of the Earth, the dot of the Earth, fell on a beam of light that had been scattered in the optics of the camera. But of course, none of this mattered, because it was what Carl had to say about this image and the way that he romanced it and turned it into an allegory on the human condition that has ever since made the phrase pale blue dot synonymous with an inspirational call to planetary brotherhood and protection of the environment. Well, ever since I became the leader of the imaging team on the Cassini mission to Saturn, I have had it in my mind to do this picture over again, only make it better. And it occurred to me somewhere along the line while I'm thinking about how to do this and when to take the observation and so on, instead of doing what we did on Voyager and what every mission since Voyager has done, and that is take a picture of the Earth and then 2 days later, 2 weeks later, release it to the public and then say, hey world, guess what we did while you weren't looking? I thought, instead of doing that, why don't we tell the people of the world ahead of time that at such and such a time on such a date, your picture is going to be taken from 1 billion miles away, and invite them to, at the moment, the window of opportunity, the window of time in which the images are going to be taken, at that moment, invite them to go out and take stock of their cosmic place and consider the isolation of our planet in the blackness of space, and to appreciate the rarity that it is among the planets that orbit the sun, and to marvel at their own existence and that of all of life on Earth. And that's exactly how it went down. On July 19, 2013, we took the Cassini cameras and pointed them at Saturn as Saturn eclipsed the sun, because that's how you could see the Earth. And at the moment that the picture was taken, we told people, straighten up, comb your hair, go out, look up, and think about all of us together on planet Earth. Think about this magnificent achievement that this interplanetary salute between robot and maker represents, and smile. And we got people from all over the globe to participate in this, and we set up a website, and we accepted comments, and we got comments from Europe, the United States, Asia, South America, Africa, just about every continent. And people wrote in describing a feeling of immense unity with everyone else on the planet. And I'm just going to read you a few of these comments because they are just endearing. This is written by Tess from somewhere I don't know. At the appropriate time, I left the table at a restaurant and I went to the parking lot. I turned my face to the sky and spent a few minutes watching and listening to what life on Earth was like, right there, right at that moment. What a feeling of connection and oneness with the miracle that is life. This experience was beyond meaningful. It was transcendent. What a beautiful thing. And this is from Sam, somewhere in England. Phoebe, age 10, and I got the telescope out on the patio. And under a beautiful, clear, southern British sky, we gazed upon Saturn, reveling in the fact that a spacecraft was looking back at us. She asked lots of questions about Saturn, and at the appropriate time, I raised a glass of fine red wine, she a glass of fizzy pop. We said cheers to Saturn, to Cassini, and to each other, and then we smiled and laughed and waved and cheered and took photos of ourselves both beaming. It was perfect. And this is from Jolyn from somewhere in upstate New York. I have been entranced by this project ever since I heard about it, and I was determined to join in the celebration. We stood on the edge of Lake Ontario, and I had forgotten to bring my cell phone with its app that shows the location of Saturn. So in the end, we just spun in circles, waving at the sky. The thought that a camera was taking pictures from so very far away was just incredible. We may not be unique, we may be transient, we may be only flying along in a dust mote, but darn it, for those 15 minutes, we were there, we were aware, and we smiled. And so it was a great success, and here now is the mosaic. I'm sure many of you have seen it. That was taken as these people and many more all over the globe were thinking about our cosmic place and smiling in the sheer joy of being alive on a pale blue dot. I've called it the day the Earth smiled. And it shows Saturn eclipsing the sun. It shows the main rings lit from behind so they look as if they glow. And it shows, in fact, the lovely blue ring that is, in fact, the result of the spray from those 100 geysers erupting from Enceladus. And if you look closely, over the shoulder of Saturn, 1 billion miles in the distance, you will find our home planet, Earth, which when looked at with even higher resolution, with our high-resolution cameras, becomes the Earth and its moon seen for the first time from the outer solar system. There is, I think you would agree, something very powerful that we feel when we catch sight of our own fragile, small blue ocean planet as it would be seen by others in the skies of other worlds. And I think it is that startling, uncorrupted view of ourselves as we really are, where we really are, that never fails to move us. And it moves me to think about evolution. In fact, for me, this is the picture where the biologist Charles Darwin and the Italian astronomer Galileo come face to face. Why? Because it is a picture that was ultimately made possible by Galileo's first experiments with gravitation over 400 years ago, and it is a picture that shouts evolution. I look at this picture and I see our distant ancestors stepping down from the trees and walking upright for the first time onto the African savannas and pausing to look back at the forests from which they came. And I look at this picture and I see a species that is unyielding in its pursuit of knowledge and brave and fervent in its longing to grasp the meaning and the significance of its own existence. And finally, I can't help but look at this picture and see the very, very best that humanity has to offer. We are, without question, the small and troubled inhabitants and warlike inhabitants of one tiny little dot of a planet, and we are reminded of this day in and day out, wherever we look all over the globe. But in those moments of what I can only refer to as existential despair, and I'm sure you have them because I have them, it would serve us well to remember that we are also the dreamers and thinkers and explorers who took this picture. One world clear across interplanetary space to another. And interplanetary is not where we will stop. We have just recently heard of a new initiative called Breakthrough Starshot, in which we are going to send a tiny craft propelled by beams of light all the way to Alpha Centauri, the nearest star, to arrive there in the not-too-distant future and conduct our first reconnaissance of another stellar system. If the passage of the Voyager spacecraft into interstellar space was our birth as an interstellar species, then the arrival at Alpha Centauri will be our baptism. And to be so small and reach so far is what makes us the extraordinary citizens of our planet and our galaxy. And it is this well-earned and proud perspective of ourselves that I think is the legacy that Voyager and Cassini and Starshot and all our explorations beyond our home planet will leave behind. How glorious will be the day when we can truthfully proclaim, in the words of science fiction writer Ray Bradbury, written in 1971 on the occasion of the insertion into Mars orbit of Mariner 9, the first spacecraft to orbit another planet, "We have reached Alpha Centauri. We are tall. Oh God, we are tall." Thank you.